Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, and I'm here with Sam. Today we're asking the ugly little democracy question. What are you supposed to do when voting is equal for everyone, but some voters openly admit they don't really know what they're voting for?
Yeah, because the uncomfortable part is that the system usually answers confusion with more information, not with less voting. The Election Assistance Commission even treats voter education as a normal part of election administration.
Right, so the basic move is to make it easier to vote well, not to decide who gets to vote. That gives us a fair starting point for the starting take. So Sam, start us off.
Okay, before we get fancy about it, here's the uncomfortable starting point. We give everybody the same vote, which is the right principle. And then we act like that settles the whole problem. It doesn't. A democracy can be equal on paper and still feel shaky in practice because people are voting on stuff they only half understand or barely understand at all.
That's the tension, yeah. And I think the first useful distinction is equal voting rights versus equal knowledge. If you blur those together, you end up sneaking in a pretty gross idea that the most confident person is somehow the most qualified one, which is not what equal voting is supposed to mean.
Right, I'm not saying the loudest guy should get a bigger ballot because he watched 3 clips and got angry. I'm saying it's strange how normal it is for people to vote on huge consequences while admitting basically, I have a vibe and a mailing address, good luck. That isn't a moral failure, it's just a little alarming.
And that's the cleaner version of the complaint. It's not voters are dumb, it's the system depends on ordinary people making serious choices under conditions that are messy, rushed, and imperfect. That is a real concern. It's just different from saying the whole thing is fake or worthless.
So am I being unfair if I say a lot of democracy runs on people pretending they know more than they do? Because I feel like there are plenty of votes where the whole process is just, this person seems less awful than the other one. And that's the intellectual depth of it.
No, that's not crazy. A lot of political judgment is shorthand, not a full policy seminar. And that's true even for people who care a lot. The problem is when shorthand gets mistaken for understanding, or when people confuse an identity cue, a party cue, or a feeling of anger with actual knowledge about what the choice will do.
That's the part that bugs me. We've built a system where being informed is treated like a personality hobby, not something the system really asks for in any serious way. Then everybody acts shocked when a bunch of voters are mostly reacting to vibes, resentment, loyalty, whatever's floating around that week.
I'd be careful with the everybody is just reacting part, because that starts sounding like contempt. And I don't think contempt gets us anywhere useful. But I do think the system quietly assumes that enough people will do a decent enough job. And that's a very different claim from saying every voter is deeply informed. Those are not the same standard.
Fair. So the complaint isn't that people are too stupid to be allowed near a ballot box. It's that we ask for enormous collective judgment and then mostly tolerate a pretty low information environment around it. That tension is the thing that makes people uneasy, even if they don't say it out loud.
Yeah, and that unease is not automatically anti-democratic. It can just be a realistic reaction to how humans behave. People are busy, distracted, partisan, tired, and often voting with partial knowledge. None of that means their vote shouldn't count. It does mean the ideal version of the system and the real version are never perfectly lined up.
So where does that leave the fair version of the argument? Because I don't want the answer to be some smug little rule where only the designated smart people count. But I also don't think we're obligated to pretend all ignorance is equally harmless just because the ballot box is morally sacred or whatever.
The fair version is probably not about ranking citizens. It's about admitting that equal votes don't erase unequal information, unequal attention, or unequal pressure from bad incentives. If the system is going to stay legitimate, it has to live honestly with that, instead of pretending the problem doesn't exist.
And that's the contradiction I want to sit with. One person, one vote sounds clean, but the reality is one vote, many levels of understanding. So the real question is not whether people deserve a voice. They do. It's what we're supposed to do with a system that asks for equal power while quietly accepting shaky knowledge. Okay, but before we turn this into a clean civic theory, here's why people get suspicious in the first place. It doesn't feel abstract when the outcome is going to land on you. You can say equal votes in a nice neutral voice, but a lot of people hear, great, we all have to live with the result, even if plenty of people were guessing.
That's the discomfort, yes. And I think it's worth saying plainly that this is not automatically some anti-democracy tantrum. The worry is that bad information, habit, and social pressure can move something that everybody has to live with.
Right, and the reason it feels shady is that politics rewards confidence way more than care. The loud, bad take gets airtime. The careful take gets treated like it has no backbone. And then we're all supposed to pretend the public was formed under ideal conditions. That part feels fake. It feels like a system asking people to bluff and then acting surprised when bluffing shows up.
So, what part is the real issue to you? The misinformation itself? Or the fact that people often know they don't know enough and just perform certainty anyway?
Both, honestly. The misinformation is bad enough on its own, but the private-public split is what makes it feel corrosive. A lot of people will admit, in a normal conversation, I don't really know this issue that well. And then 2 minutes later, they'll talk like they've got the whole thing sorted because nobody wants to sound weak in public.
That's a real thing. People don't usually say, I'm uncertain, because uncertainty gets read as not caring or not belonging. So the culture rewards the performance of confidence, and then everybody acts like that performance is the same as understanding.
Exactly. And that's why this is not just some civics class complaint where everybody sits around politely discussing turnout. It's more like watching people make huge decisions with half a map and a lot of social pressure, then hearing them speak as if they had a full briefing. The frustrating part is that the gap between the public story and the private uncertainty is visible to almost everyone. So when somebody says, are voters actually informed? It doesn't sound like a seminar question. It sounds like, are we all being asked to live with decisions made under conditions nobody really wants to describe honestly?
Careful there, because that's where people start hearing contempt. You can say, the system tolerates a lot of confusion, without saying ordinary voters are stupid. Those are not the same claim.
Fair. I'm not saying people need to pass some nerd exam or that only policy people count. I'm saying there is a difference between I know enough to make a decent choice and I saw a slogan I liked and called it civic participation. That second one is common, and pretending it is deep democratic wisdom makes the whole thing smell worse.
And that's the useful distinction. The complaint isn't ordinary people are bad. It's we've built a system where bluffing is easy, certainty gets rewarded, and then everyone has to act like the bluff never mattered. That doesn't mean the fix is gatekeeping votes. It means the discomfort is pointing at a real design problem, not just snobbery.
Yeah, and the reason people keep coming back to it is because they can feel the difference between having a vote and actually knowing what you're voting for. The useful question is not whether everybody should be an expert. It's what minimum kind of understanding makes the choice honest instead of just theatrical. Okay, before we keep arguing off vibes, we need to split two things people keep mashing together: the right to vote and the question of whether a voter is actually making a competent choice.
That's the clean starting point. Because once those get treated like the same thing, Everybody starts talking past each other and then pretending they've won.
And when people say some voters don't understand what they're voting for, they usually mean three different complaints and act like it's one. They might mean uninformed, they might mean misinformed, or they might mean somebody is just voting from emotion and calling that a plan.
Right, and there's a fourth bucket too, uncertain. A lot of people aren't confidently wrong. They're just half-formed on the issue and picking from the messy options in front of them.
Which is already more honest than the fake version of this argument, where not fully informed gets treated like a scarlet letter. Because nobody is fully informed on everything. Nobody is reading every ballot measure like it's their job.
Exactly. The relevant question is not whether someone knows everything, because that's impossible. It's whether they know enough about this specific choice for the vote to be meaningful instead of random.
So let me pin you down on that, Joe. What counts as enough? Because if we leave it fuzzy, people will use it as an excuse to call basically everybody clueless whenever they lose.
That's the right pressure point. I'd avoid pretending there's one universal threshold because different offices and ballot questions ask for different kinds of knowledge. Voting for president is not the same thing as voting on a local school issue. And even that's too simple if you think about it for 5 seconds.
That's the useful distinction. Competence isn't some permanent personality trait like height or eye color. It's more like a match between the decision and what you actually understand about it.
Yes, and that means a person can be solidly competent on one issue and pretty shaky on another without that being some grand moral failure. Most people are a mixed bag, which is boring but true.
And that boring fact matters because the smug version of this debate is basically, if you don't know everything, sit down, which is just a fancy way of saying only experts are allowed to have opinions. And that's not how democracy works.
That's the trap, yeah. The fair version is narrower. Does this person have enough relevant understanding to make a real choice on this question? Or are they just absorbing a slogan and rolling it downhill?
And even there, bad choices don't all come from ignorance. Sometimes people know the trade-off and hate it. Sometimes they vote from identity, resentment, loyalty, fear, or just because they like one side's vibe more than the other.
Or because they care about one thing very intensely and are willing to tolerate the rest. That may be annoying, but it is not the same as being tricked. And it's definitely not the same as being stupid.
That's the part people keep flattening. They say ignorance when they really mean, I don't like the reason you used. And those are not identical complaints.
And the opposite mistake is to hide behind, oh, everyone is ignorant, as if that makes the whole concern go away. It doesn't. It just means we need a better label for the problem than some giant insult that covers too much.
So where do you draw the line then? What separates a voter who's merely uninformed from one who's actually being manipulated or operating on bad information?
I'd separate 3 things. Lack of information, bad information, and a system that keeps people confused on purpose. Those need different answers. And if we don't separate them, we'll pick the wrong fix and then act surprised when nothing changes.
And there's a practical problem buried in there too. A person can be missing a lot of context without being manipulated. And a manipulated person can sound weirdly confident because the bad information gives them a very tidy story.
Yeah, which is why confidence is a terrible shortcut for competence. Loud doesn't mean informed. Calm doesn't mean informed either. It just means the person has a tone.
That should be on a bumper sticker somewhere. The worst part is people use confidence as proof when they're already looking for permission to dismiss somebody.
And once you do that, you stop asking the real question, which is not, do we like this voter, but what level of understanding is relevant for this vote, and who gets to decide that without turning it into a gate?
Okay, that's cleaner. So the real question isn't, are voters smart enough? It's what democracy should do about limited understanding without turning voting into a privilege test.
Exactly. And that's where the conversation gets dangerous fast. Because once you start deciding who counts as competent, you're not just judging knowledge anymore. You're deciding how much equal voting rights are worth.
Okay, so we're at the first bad answer. Just test voters, or weight the vote, or make people prove they know what they're doing before they get equal power. It sounds tidy because it turns a messy frustration into a clean rule.
And that clean rule is always where people start pretending there's a neutral adult in the room. There isn't. There's a person making a political decision about what counts as competence. And that is where the whole thing starts leaning sideways.
So what would make that idea legitimate instead of just authoritarian with better branding? Because I get why people reach for it. They're not usually saying, I hate democracy. They're saying, I'm tired of watching people vote like they're guessing.
That's the fair version of the complaint. The problem is that once you turn that feeling into a rule, you have to answer who gets to grade the public, what they're grading, and what happens when the grader is wrong or biased.
And the appeal is obvious, honestly. If I had to prove I understood the thing I was voting on, part of me would think, fine, at least the adults are in the building. It feels like a way to separate actual participation from pure noise.
Right. But that's where the fantasy starts chewing on the real world. A test doesn't just punish ignorance. It also punishes people for having less time, worse schooling, worse access to information, or less comfort with bureaucratic games.
And then everybody pretends it's just about knowledge. But every election would turn into a fight over which knowledge counts, which facts are basic, and whether the test is checking civic understanding or just checking whether you know the stuff the people in charge like.
Exactly. Who writes it, who updates it, who appeals it, who gets to say a question was fair, that's the real machine. The minute you ask those questions, you're not designing a neutral filter. You're building a bureaucracy around deciding which voters are worthy.
And the people running that machine would swear they're just protecting informed democracy, which is always how a gate starts talking when it wants to sound polite. Nobody in power ever says, we'd like to make this harder for the people we don't trust.
No, they say standards, which is why this gets slippery fast. Because the first abuse usually isn't a cartoon villain. It's selective enforcement. Easier questions for one crowd, harder questions for another. And a lot of confidence that nobody will notice the pattern. And the wording is where it gets ugly. Because you can make the same person look informed or clueless just by asking.
By asking what you wanted them to memorize. Yeah. That's not measuring voters. That's measuring whether they guessed the teacher's favorite chapter.
Right. And once that starts, the test becomes a proxy for class, schooling, language, and general comfort with institutions. People who are already easier for the system to read will always look more competent, even if that's just because they know how to play the format.
So the bad answer isn't just mean. It also misses the actual frustration, because the frustration is usually people are deciding on garbage information, not I want fewer people in the room. Those are different problems.
That's the distinction worth keeping. If you want a defensible position, you have to ask what would improve understanding, reduce manipulation, or make choices clearer while leaving equal votes intact. The second you start sorting the worthy from the unworthy, you're back in the wrong conversation.
Okay, so the bad answer is dead. Now it's the two serious instincts. Protect equal votes no matter what. Or admit that ignorance and manipulation can still mess with democracy badly enough that pretending otherwise is kind of dishonest.
And both instincts are real. The equality first argument says the minute you start grading voters, the abuse writes itself, because whoever defines competent eventually gets to decide who counts as a real citizen.
That's the part people smooth over. They hear maybe voters are uninformed and immediately jump to, great, let's let the smart people run the country. No thanks. That's how you end up building a polite little machine for shutting people out.
Right. And even before you get to the politics of it, the competence idea sounds cleaner than it is. Plenty of people vote with limited information, but so do people who are confident, loud, and completely wrong. Confidence is not competence.
So the strongest version of the equality first side is not everyone is equally informed. It's equal voting rights are the price of not letting power decide after the fact who was allowed to matter.
That's the cleanest defense, honestly. Democracy has to tolerate messy voters because the alternative is letting somebody call messiness a disqualifier. Once that door opens, history does not exactly send you reassuring postcards.
And to be fair, that instinct isn't paranoid. If you tell people, don't worry, we're only filtering out the uninformed, the next question is always, who gets to do the filtering and who gets suspiciously spared? That's not a side issue. That's the whole game.
Exactly. The equality first side is basically saying the cure can be worse than the disease because the disease is frustration, and the cure is handing some authority the power to label other citizens as lesser participants.
Okay, but the other serious take is not most voters are idiots, take away their rights. It's more like if huge numbers of people are voting on misinformation, vibes, or pure team loyalty, then the system can be formally fair and practically broken.
That's the hard part. A democracy can have equal ballots and still be degraded if people are being nudged by junk, outrage, or straight-up confusion. The problem isn't just wrong votes. It's that the whole conversation gets cheaper.
And then legitimacy starts to leak. The outcome can start feeling less like collective judgment and more like whoever shouted the loudest, marketed the best, or managed to make everybody too exhausted to keep paying attention.
So the competence first worry is really about system performance, not human worth. That matters because if you say some voters are uninformed, you can mean they're bad people, or you can mean the process is too easy to game. Those are very different claims.
Yeah, and I think people often dodge that distinction because the second version sounds less dramatic. But the second version is the one worth taking seriously. I don't want a vote test. I want to admit that everyone gets one vote does not magically mean everyone is well equipped to use it.
That's the useful distinction. Equal rights and equal knowledge are not the same thing, and pretending they are makes the conversation mushy. It also makes it too easy for everybody to hide behind slogans instead of looking at how people actually get information.
So let me push you on the fair version of your side. If you're not asking for a competence test, what are you actually saying should change? Because people are uninformed is a real complaint, but it can't just sit there forever like a complaint with a tie on.
Mostly, I'm saying the response has to live upstream from the ballot. Better civic information, less junk, fewer incentives to reward pure emotional reflex. Not perfect control, just a system that takes the quality of public judgment more seriously than it usually does.
That's fair. And honestly, it's the version I can live with. Once you say fix the information environment instead of sort the voters, the whole thing stops sounding like a velvet rope democracy.
And I'll concede the other side too. The equality first argument isn't just abstract principle sniffing. It's a real protection against abuse, and not a small one. If you lose that, you may not get it back in any form you'd recognize.
So the usable version is keep equal suffrage, but stop pretending low information voting is a fake problem. That's the tension. Legitimacy from process versus legitimacy from outcomes. And those don't always line up neatly.
Yeah, one side is saying, don't hand the keys to whoever claims to know better. The other is saying, don't shrug when the steering wheel is getting yanked by people who barely know where they're going. And now we can finally test which concern holds up better.
Okay, but before we keep arguing about whether voters are smart enough, I think we have to separate the ugly feeling from the actual system. The ugly feeling is a lot of people are voting with half the info. The system question is what you do about that without turning democracy into a background check.
And the boring answer, at least in the US, is mostly information. The Election Assistance Commission treats voter education as a normal part of election administration. Nonpartisan, factual information.
So the
about
official
the time,
answer is
date,
basically
and manner of voting.
Help people vote. Don't start sorting them into worthy and unworthy piles.
Pretty much. And they also treat state and local election offices as the trusted source for accurate voting information, with toolkits and guides for officials. It's the least dramatic fix possible, which is usually why it survives.
That is such a democracy sentence. Not sexy, not heroic, just here's where the line is, here's how to get there. Please stop hallucinating the rest.
And that matters more than it sounds like. When the basic voting information is clear, people aren't being asked to become political scholars. They're being asked to get the facts that let them participate. There's also evidence that the information environment matters a lot. Better news environments can increase knowledge of party positions, and people who are more informed are more likely to participate.
Okay, Joe, am I overstating it if I say that already tells you something embarrassing about democracy? We keep pretending the ideal voter has a spreadsheet and a fixed sense of civic duty, but the real system is run by people grabbing cues, half-remembered headlines, and whatever their cousin texted them at dinner.
That's fair, with one caveat. Shortcuts are not the same thing as stupidity. A classic study on voting behavior found that voters often use cues instead of encyclopedic knowledge. And in some elections, they can behave pretty much as if they are well informed. But that depends on the contest.
So the dirty secret is that democracy already runs on vibes. Just not only vibes. The question is whether the vibes are attached to something real or whether everybody is just staring at the label and guessing the rest.
Right, and the visible part matters. One comparative study of Canadian elections found that when all parties had some visibility, less informed voters tended to vote similarly to better informed voters. But when a party was barely visible, the less informed were less likely to support it.
That's the memorable detail then. Low information doesn't automatically mean chaos. Sometimes it just means obscurity wins, or at least gets less of a fair shot, which is a nicer way of saying the hidden stuff gets punished.
Exactly. And that pushes the practical answer in a pretty unglamorous direction. Make the information less hidden and less useless. Clear official guidance, visible options, less friction, fewer traps. Not because that creates a perfect voter, but because it keeps the system from relying on people already knowing everything.
So the issue isn't really, can we build a citizen who knows everything? It's, can we make the vote legible enough that ordinary people aren't flying blind? That's a much less smug question.
And it's the right one. Because if you ask for encyclopedic mastery, you've already lost the argument. Most democracies are not run by people who can explain every office, every issue, and every trade-off in real time.
Which is both reassuring and horrifying. Reassuring because the bar was never actually that high. Horrifying because a lot of political debate acts like if you don't know every detail, you shouldn't be allowed anywhere near the lever.
That's the unfair leap. The fair part is that ignorance is real, and it can distort outcomes when the information environment is bad or the choices are invisible. The system's response is usually to lower friction, improve guidance, and assume people will lean on shortcuts, whether we like it or not.
So the system isn't built to find perfect voters. It's built to survive ordinary ignorance without becoming a screening machine. That feels like the honest version people skip when they want to sound superior.
Right, and that still leaves the messy part. If confusion is predictable, somebody can benefit from keeping it muddy. That's where the argument stops being about competence in the abstract and starts getting closer to incentives.
Okay, so once we stop blaming the average voter for being a human being with a job and a phone, the next question is, who actually keeps this machine running? Because somebody benefits from the whole thing staying kind of foggy.
That's the right move. Not who is secretly controlling everything, just who gets paid in attention, leverage, and reduced accountability when things stay blurry.
Politicians are the easiest place to start. If you can win by making people furious about the other team, you don't have to do the annoying part where you explain what you'd actually do.
And that's not just laziness, it's incentives. Emotional sorting is efficient. It gets loyalty, it gets turnout, and it lets the message be identity first and comprehension second.
Which is a very polite way of saying the campaign discovers that if it can keep you mad, it can keep you moving. It does not need you to understand the whole file folder.
Right, but I want to keep the distinction clean. That does not mean every politician is sitting there thinking, how do I trick people today? It means the environment rewards messages that are simpler, more tribal, and easier to repeat than messages that require actual effort.
Fair. I'm not saying they wake up twirling a mustache. I'm saying the system gives them a reason to act like the audience is a temperature gauge instead of a bunch of citizens trying to sort out policy.
That's the useful version. And the same logic shows up in media environments. A Cambridge study found that the outlet matters for how much voters learn about party positions, which is basically the boring but important point that the information environment shapes what people know.
So the news environment is not just a mirror. It can be a filter that tells people what kind of politics is worth paying attention to and what kind gets pushed aside.
Exactly. And the study's implication is pretty plain. If the environment helps people learn more, they're better equipped to participate. If it doesn't, the quality of participation drops. That's not moral panic. It's just how information works.
And platforms are even more blunt about it because they're built to notice what keeps people watching, clicking, and sharing. If outrage and team signaling travel better than careful explanation, the system learns that very fast.
That's the part people miss when they act like this is only about voter character. The platform does not need to hate democracy to reward shallow political content. It just needs to prefer what gets engagement.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the platform and media incentives push people towards shortcuts because shortcuts are easier to monetize than understanding?
That's close, but I'd tighten it. Easier to monetize is part of it. Easier to distribute is part of it. And easier for audiences is part of it. The stronger claim is that the whole ecosystem tends to reward low-friction political behavior, even when nobody is explicitly plotting that outcome.
That's the cleaner version. And it also explains why campaigns lean on shortcuts too, because people often use shortcuts when they vote. There's research showing voters can rely on shortcuts and still behave as though they're informed in some settings. So campaigns are matching the habit they already see.
Exactly. If voters are already processing politics through cues, then the strategic move is to give them cues. That can be useful, but it also means the race to be understandable can turn into a race to be emotionally sticky.
And that's where the social pressure comes in too. People don't just want to be correct, they want to be on the right team. And sometimes the team reward is bigger than the reward for being careful.
Which is why blaming isolated voters misses the shape of the problem. Yes, people make choices, but they're making them inside a setup that often rewards speed, signaling, and loyalty more than understanding.
So the honest answer is not that voters are hopeless, and it's not that there's one puppet master behind the curtain. It's that a bunch of players get enough benefit from fuzziness that the fuzziness keeps coming back.
Yeah. Parties get loyalty, media gets attention, platforms get engagement, and people get social credit for backing their side without doing the annoying homework. That's why the problem reproduces itself, even when everybody insists they just want better information.
Okay, so the polite version is that democracy is citizens weighing ideas, judging leaders, and making a serious collective decision. The real question is what happens when that story bumps into the fact that a lot of people are partly doing that and partly protecting their tribe, their mood, or the story they already like.
That's the tension worth sitting with. The polite version isn't fake. It's the aspiration people want the system to live up to. But it also flatters how much attention most of us can sustain on a random Tuesday.
And the uncomfortable part is nobody wants to say that out loud because it sounds like you're insulting the whole public when really you're just noticing how people behave when politics stops being abstract and starts feeling like us versus
them. Sure. But don't turn that into everyone is dumb.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying human. People don't walk around as pure policy machines. They vote with identity, emotion, habit, family cues, and whatever feels like it protects their side.
And emotion isn't automatically a bug. If you care about whether your rent goes up, whether your kid's school is decent, or whether your rights are treated like a joke, that feeling is part of the judgment.
So what am I missing? Because that sounds less like moral failure and more like the default human package.
The missing piece is that emotion can steer the choice, or it can just color the choice. Those are not the same thing, and people blur them whenever they want to sound either smug or innocent.
That's the part people dodge, because the polished public answer is, I carefully evaluated the issues. And the less polished answer is, my side felt closer to my life, and the other side felt unbearable.
Which is often more honest than people admit. Not noble, not ideal, but honest enough that we can work with it.
And identity doesn't have to mean stupidity. It can just mean people are social animals who use shortcuts. And politics is full of those shortcuts, whether we like it or not.
Exactly. Identity can be normal without being the whole explanation. You can belong to a side, trust a community, and still make some real judgments. But once the identity becomes the only lens, the judgment gets smaller and smaller.
That's the part people hate admitting in public, because the clean story is that voting is basically civic math. The messier story is that a lot of people start with who they are, then build the reasons around that choice afterward.
And to be fair, that doesn't make every vote a fraud. Sometimes people really do come in through identity or motion and still land on a decent judgment. The problem is pretending the process was pure when it clearly wasn't.
I think that's the useful line. Equal votes are real, but equal votes do not magically create equal knowledge or equal attention. If we talk like everybody is perfectly informed, we end up designing for a fantasy voter.
Right, and if we go too far the other way, we start acting like participation is just a scam, and every vote is a tantrum in a blazer. That's not insight. It's snobbery with a tie on.
So the honest answer is uglier but better. Democracy is supposed to reward reasoned judgment. But in real life, it's part reason, part identity, part emotion, and part habit. That doesn't kill it. It just means we have to stop pretending the public story is the whole machine. Okay, but this is where it can go off the rails. We can say voters are misled, overloaded, emotional, half-informed, all of that, without jumping straight to, so democracy is basically a joke. That jump is where the argument stops sounding serious and starts sounding like a guy in a bad mood with a theory.
That's the break we need. The fact that people make bad choices in a messy information system does not prove the whole system is illegitimate. And it definitely does not prove voters are worthless. It proves the system is vulnerable, which is a very different claim.
Right, because the temptation is to turn a real complaint into a moral costume. You start with, people get manipulated, and before you know it, you're talking like everyone else is a sap except you, which is just a very smug way to be wrong.
And it makes the argument weaker. Once you go into blanket contempt, you stop distinguishing between bad information, ordinary ignorance, and the few cases where somebody is acting in genuinely bad faith. If everything is the same level of stupid or corrupt, then nothing is actually being analyzed.
Joe, where would you draw the line if somebody says, look, the average voter is too uninformed for this to be fair? Because I think that sentence sounds like a warning, but it can also be the first step toward deciding other adults don't count.
The line is whether you're talking about a problem with the environment or a problem with the person's right to participate. You can say, this environment makes informed choice harder than it should be. You cannot responsibly turn that into, therefore, some people should have less say. That's where the complaint stops being about quality and starts being about hierarchy.
That last jump is the ugly one, because once you start ranking human beings by political competence, you are no longer just complaining about bad information. You are drifting into gatekeeping citizenship. And that is a different argument with a much nastier smell to it.
Exactly. Equal voting rights only make sense if they are equal even when the person voting annoys you, votes emotionally, or misunderstands the issue in a way you find embarrassing. The whole point is not that every vote is wise. It's that the right is not handed out as a prize for impressing you.
Which is annoying because the emotional response is still, but come on, look at the mess. And the mess is real. People get nudged, misinformed, swept up in team politics, and pushed into choices they barely understand. That part is not paranoia. It's just the ordinary ugliness of a system that runs on attention and panic.
Sure, the mess is real. And saying that is not anti-democratic. What becomes anti-democratic is when the complaint stops being, this is vulnerable to manipulation, and becomes, I don't trust the people, so the people should matter less. Those are not the same thought, even if they can sound similar when somebody is irritated.
And to be fair, sometimes that suspicion is just the political version of feeling superior. It's the guy at the bar who thinks he's the only adult in the room because he read 3 headlines and now everyone else is an idiot. That guy is not diagnosing democracy. He's auditioning for the role of most annoying person alive.
Yeah, and that feeling is understandable for about 4 seconds. After that, it stops being insight and starts being a personality flaw. The stronger version is much less glamorous. Bad information is common. Institutions are incentivized to exploit it. And none of that gets solved by sneering at voters or pretending contempt is clarity.
So the responsible complaint is not democracy is fake. It's democracy is under constant pressure from confusion, manipulation, and half-truths. So we should be honest about that without pretending we're allowed to revoke everybody's say. That sounds less dramatic, but it's also the version that still makes sense in the morning.
That's the usable version. You can say the system is too easy to game, too easy to overwhelm, and too dependent on people doing the homework they don't always have time to do. That's a real complaint. It just has to stay on the level of improving the conditions, not punishing the citizens for being human.
And honestly, that last part is why people get touchy about this. They hear criticism of voting competence and assume the next sentence is going to be, only the smart people get to participate, which is where the whole conversation becomes a garbage fire in a suit.
Exactly. The fair standard is criticize the incentives, criticize the information environment, criticize the cheap manipulation, but don't slide into writing off the public as a category. If your answer needs voter contempt to work, it's not a better argument. It's a lazy one. And the next question is what part of this mess we helped make worse.
Okay, but here's the annoying part. If we're talking about voting competence, we can't keep acting like all the damage comes from the top. People aren't just victims of bad political media. They're also the reason bad political media pays. If we keep clicking, sharing, and arguing with the stupid version, we shouldn't be shocked when the stupid version keeps showing up with better lighting.
That's the cleaner version. Not the public is the problem. More like the public is part of the incentive loop. If low-effort outrage gets attention, then every click is a tiny vote for more low-effort outrage. Not because people are evil, just because platforms and humans are both very reward-sensitive in the dumbest possible way.
And before anybody gets precious about it, that includes us. We say we hate dumb politics, and then we all lean in when some politician says something insane, because it's funny, or infuriating, or both. That's not a moral crime. It's just the part where people pretend they want seriousness and then keep feeding the carnival because seriousness takes longer.
And the group chat is where that really shows up. Somebody drops a clipped video, 3 people react instantly, and now the whole conversation is about who sounded strongest, not who was right. That is not some grand corruption plot. It's just ordinary people rewarding certainty, because certainty is easier to pass around than context.
Exactly. And once that becomes the habit, the cheap version of politics starts looking normal. The person who actually says, I need to read more before I take a position, sounds slow. Meanwhile, the loudest person in the room gets treated like they're decisive, even if they're just confident in the wrong direction.
So, where do you draw the line between ordinary attention habits and actual blame? Because I think that's the point where this conversation goes bad if we're sloppy. If you make it sound like every annoyed voter is personally responsible for the whole mess, you lose the useful part and keep only the scolding.
I think blame is too big a word. Influence is better. Most people are not designing the system, but they are choosing the version of politics that feels easiest to consume. If nuance dies in the group chat, it doesn't die because of one villain. It dies because everybody keeps taking the shortcut and calling it being informed.
That is a little too clean. Some people are exhausted, some are underinformed, and some are doing the lazy thing because it flatters them. Those are different moral situations. The fair criticism isn't everyone's guilty. It's that the ecosystem keeps rewarding the least careful behavior, so the careful behavior gets treated like a weird hobby.
Fair. I'm not saying every confused voter is a jerk. I'm saying there's a difference between being misled and actively preferring the lowest friction story. And a lot of political media survives because audiences keep proving there is a market for certainty with no homework. That's the ugly little commerce of it. People complain about the product while continuing to buy the packaging.
That's the real social problem. We keep asking for politics to be legible in 30 seconds, then act shocked when what gets rewarded is performance instead of competence. And families do this too. Not in some dramatic villain way, just in the everyday way where nobody wants to be the person who says, "I don't know enough to have an opinion."
Yeah, because in a lot of rooms, uncertainty gets treated like weakness. At work, at dinner, in text threads, if you pause too long, people act like you're uninformed or soft. So people bluff. They pick a side fast, repeat the loud line, and act like hesitation is some kind of character flaw. Joe, am I overstating that? Because it feels like half of political confidence is just people trying not to look like the only one at the table without a ready-made take.
Not really. The pressure is real, and it does push people toward fake certainty, but I wouldn't say everybody's bluffing in the same way. A lot of people are just trying to stay included in the conversation, and politics has turned into a loyalty test way too often. That's the part worth naming, without turning it into a sermon.
Which is why the self-critique matters. If we keep rewarding the most confident mouth in the room, then we help create the climate where competence gets buried under vibe and team sports. That doesn't mean voters deserve contempt. It means we need a better social standard than say the loudest thing with the least hesitation. If you don't know, say you don't know. If you share something, at least know whether you're sharing it because it's true or because it flatters your side.
That's the useful pressure point. Not be ashamed of voting, just stop rewarding certainty like it's the same thing as effort. If the next conversation is about fixes, that standard matters because it gives people something concrete to do in their own circles before they start asking institutions to save them from the culture they helped make.
Okay, we've spent all this time diagnosing the rot. So now the annoying question is the one people actually care about. What would make this less broken without turning voting into some fake club with a velvet rope?
The least glamorous answer is also the most defensible one. Make the official information easier to find, easier to read, and harder to confuse with campaign noise. Election offices can give people reliable information, sample ballots, accessible voting details, and plain design guidance, instead of making voters dig through a maze of junk.
So basically, stop making people hunt through 10 weird tabs in a PDF that looks like it lost a fight with Microsoft Word. That feels almost too obvious to count as reform, which is probably why nobody gets excited about it.
Obvious is fine if the obvious thing is not being done. A lot of voter education is just navigation. How to register, where to find a sample ballot, what accessible voting looks like, what the basic rules are, and what language the official materials use. That is not a competence test. It is the system explaining itself like it should have from the beginning.
But does easier information actually change anything? or do we just make the same confused person slightly more efficiently confused? I'm asking that seriously because there's a lot of civic reform stuff that sounds good, right up until it meets the average distracted human.
Sometimes it changes a lot, sometimes only a little. But there's evidence that when people are mobilized to vote, they also become more informed about the election content, which is a nice reminder that participation and learning are not enemies. If you lower the cost of showing up, you can also lower the cost of paying attention.
That's the first thing in this whole conversation that doesn't sound like a postcard. So in practice, are we talking better voter guides, clearer ballots, official explanations that don't read like committee soup, maybe even the same layout from county to county so people aren't relearning the whole process every time?
Yes, and with the annoying caveat that none of that is magic. Voter guides that summarize candidate positions can help, but the effects are uneven and hard to measure, especially if people never read them. The honest version is not one pamphlet saves democracy. It's good summaries are better than vibes and ads.
Good, because the second you say voter education campaign, some politician hears, we should make a patriotic commercial and call it reform. I'd rather have boring, consistent guidance than that whole parade. And I'd rather have one clear place to check the facts than 6 polished messages fighting each other.
That's the part worth keeping. The most defensible reforms are the ones that improve the information environment without deciding who deserves a vote. Better sample ballots, clearer official websites, plain language election explanations, and standardized formats so people aren't decoding a different layout in every county. The EAC already treats reliable voter information as an official responsibility, which is the right direction.
So the real target is usability, not smarter people, just fewer stupid traps between a citizen and the actual choice. Give people the front door, not a scavenger hunt.
That's the useful distinction. And the trade-off matters, because if you try to fix this by dumping more and more material on people, you recreate the same problem from the other side. Better is usually shorter, clearer, and more structured. Answer the basic questions first, then leave deeper detail available for the people who want it.
Where would you draw the line, though? Because more information can turn into dump the entire internet on people and pretend that's civic duty.
The line is whether the reform helps people answer the practical questions they actually need. Who is on the ballot? What the race is about? How to vote? What the options are if they need accessibility help? And where the official info lives. Once you start pretending every voter needs a seminar on every office, you're back in fantasy land.
So the good fix is not gatekeeping, not hero worship, just cleaner information and lower friction, which is annoyingly unsexy, but probably the first thing worth doing before anyone starts dreaming up a test for the public.
That's where I land. And the next question is whether campaign and media norms can support that. Because if everyone lies loudly enough, even a clean ballot guide only does so much.
Okay, so the last honest question isn't whether voters are flawless. It's whether the problem is bad citizenship or a system that makes bad choices way too easy to make. Because those are not the same thing. And people keep trying to mash them together when they get frustrated.
That's the better frame. Once you admit people can be underinformed or manipulated, the real question becomes, what kind of fix doesn't blow up equal voting rights? If the answer changes who gets the same vote, you're not repairing democracy anymore. You're quietly redesigning it around suspicion.
So where would you draw the line then? When does help people vote better turn into
The minute you start changing who gets the same vote?
yeah, that's it. And the reason people keep reaching for the bad version is that they're looking at the mess and thinking, if we don't test for competence, aren't we just handing the whole place over to confusion? That fear is real. I just don't think it points where people want it to point.
That's the fair version of the complaint. What isn't fair is turning that worry into a ranking of people. The problem is real. People vote with partial information. Campaigns feed them garbage. And a lot of the civic environment rewards noise more than clarity. None of that disappears just because somebody says personal responsibility in a serious voice. What part of the worry do you think is actually legitimate, and what part crosses into elitist nonsense? Because I think people sometimes hide a pretty ugly instinct inside a perfectly reasonable frustration.
The legitimate part is that a lot of voters are trying to do a serious job with weak inputs. They don't always have time, they don't always have context, and the system is not exactly helping them out. That is not a moral failure by default. The ugly part is when somebody takes that reality and turns it into, well, then some citizens should count less. That jump is where the whole thing goes bad.
Right. And once you go there, you haven't solved the information problem. You've just outsourced authority to whoever gets to define qualified that year. That's not neutral. It's just a power move with better manners. The original complaint may have been about confusion, but the fix starts acting like the real problem is the public itself.
Which is why the boring fixes are still the real ones. Clearer official information, simpler ballots, less friction, easier access to the basics, and civic conditions that don't let lies become the fastest thing in the room. Not asking voters to become experts, just not making them dig through garbage to find the facts. That's a much less glamorous answer, but it's the one that actually respects equal voting rights.
And that's the hard part, honestly. You want to improve democratic conditions without turning them into a gatekeeping project. And that means you have to stay annoyingly specific about what you're fixing. Better summaries, better access, better incentives, less junk. Not a purity test, not a hierarchy, just a system that works harder for ordinary people instead of assuming they'll somehow absorb the truth by vibes alone.
Yeah, that's where I land too. Keep the vote equal, admit the complaint was real, and stop pretending a competence test is anything other than a sneaky way to make the democracy feel cleaner by making it less equal. The honest ending is not that people are perfect. It's that the system has to stop rewarding confusion and start making the basic facts easier to reach.
That wraps up today's question. We're glad you listened to Say the Question. Make sure you're following so you catch the next one tomorrow.